Hi everyone! So if this is your first time seeing my face, welcome. If you're returning to the channel, welcome back. So today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. So recently I made my first shapewear purchase. I really wanted to wear a specific dress and I wanted to make sure, one, I did not flash everybody, but also two, that I just wanted everything to be a little bit smoother, you know. But so I decided to mosey on down to my local Target, and I know that if you're interested in shapewear, you might be like cringing because Target is not necessarily the shapewear capital. It doesn't have the best shapewear, but you know what? Sometimes you're on a budget. So went down to Target and I made my first purchase, and I'll insert them here. But I went and bought some bottoms that were just like a little bit more compressing, and they kind of rode up a little bit, like kind of towards like a high-waisted type thing, but they were from a brand called Assets by Spanx, and Spanx is like obviously well known, but Assets is kind of their local Target line, so it was a little less expensive, but I feel like it was still pretty good quality. But ever since I made that first shapewear purchase, I really kind of started getting into learning about shapewear and how it can like help people achieve a certain look, and I just started really getting into it. So although I was skeptical of shapewear and the shapewear industry at first, because I feel like in some regards it gives in a lot to toxic diet culture, and also it kind of perpetuates a certain feminine ideal that a lot of people don't fit into. So I wasn't quite sure if I was going to like shapewear brands, but I actually really like them, and I started getting into learning more about shapewear because I feel like I wanted to be more informed. And since I started looking more into shapewear, I started getting a lot more advertisements about corsets and corsetting and waist training, and so I was like, okay, I want to do my research and look more into these types of waist cinching, body modification type instruments. And here I want to kind of take a time out and pause and talk about the different language and vocabulary associated with this type of shapewear body modification. So from what I saw, there is the corsets, which are the traditional kind of boning, in-boning. Waist cinching can be achieved by corsets, but it's not necessary. So corsets can be kind of decorative or just kind of there to achieve a certain shape. Like there's multiple uses for a corset. And so from what I've learned, a waist trainer is a little different because a waist trainer is specifically only meant to cinch your waist. It's supposed to train your waist to be a more hourglass figure or achieve that. Whereas a corset, that's not necessarily the purpose all the time. A corset can definitely waist cinch, but it doesn't have to be a waist trainer all the time. So I feel like there's a distinction, even though they're used kind of interchangeably, and I probably will throw them out interchangeably. I think the modern conception of a waist trainer is very different than corsetting and kind of all of the stuff revolving the art of corsets. Which, while we're talking about language, let me just say I'm about to say corsets so many times that it's either gonna be right or you're gonna hate it. Corsets, tomato. I'm so sorry. It's starting not to sound like a real word to me, but that's just like an explanation for if you hear something and you're like, what is she saying? I mean corsets. Yeah. So before making this video, I had a specific idea, kind of like with the shapewear, of what corset as a fashion trend and the idea of waist training meant. And although while doing this research for this video, I think some of my preconceived notions about this fashion trend were upheld, I think I was shocked to find myself actually changing my stance a little bit, revolving around corsetting and waist training and those types of body modification fashions, specifically how people use them in a modern context. I kind of changed and altered. So I was surprised to find myself actually being drawn to the concept of corsetting and waist training. And I think a lot of that had to do with the community I saw around these practices. Seeing how passionate people were about corsets, waist training, and tight lacing made me eager to try them out myself. But before we get into the community surrounding these concepts, I first want to dive in and do a brief skim of the history of specifically corsets, but also how corsets kind of go into waist training. So although corsetting, or the shaping of the body to achieve an hourglass form, may have began as early as 1000 BC, the modern examples of corseting and waist training began in earnest around the 16th century, where women of specific status, usually also from the West, made corsets from hard items, specifically whalebones, wood, and ivory. These corsets worn in the Elizabethan era were not considered to be the typical waist trainers of the Victorian era corsets, but instead these corsets during the 16th century were more cylindrical and did not help the wearer achieve a traditional hourglass look. Most information I could find said that the goal of the corsets in the 16th and somewhat into the 17th century were to create a more defined chest and flatten the stomach. And although the waist was slimmed down, that wasn't the overarching goal from what I've read. The goal of these types of corsets during this time period were not necessarily to achieve this hourglass look. It was more of just like an unintended side effect. So that was not the beauty standard at the time. Additionally, these corsets during the 16th and 17th century were stiff and supposedly uncomfortable, causing many people to begin questioning their usefulness and purpose. During this time period, these corsets were becoming more of a fashion trend, especially in Europe, and especially for the people of a certain class or the elite status of women who did not have to go into the fields and work. And this would become a theme of corsets. They were typically associated with a certain status. Not only were quality corsets expensive, they also required other people's help, so people would help you get into corsets and tight lace you in the back. Obviously, we've seen examples in modern day movies, but that was pretty similar to how they were utilized in the past. Additionally, the people who were usually helping you were servants, so you had to have a certain level of class to have a servant help you, or you could have siblings, but that was a little less common. And they were also the people who utilized these corsets were people who weren't expected to do physical labor. So the ideal candidate for wearing a corset all day were rich women who did not have to toil in the fields and could afford to buy a corset and the accompanying garments, which is important because a corset is just one item of clothing, and it usually was accompanied by other rich and intricate garments and fabrics. Moving forward in time, the colonial corset, which the colonial era, let's define from like the 17th to 18th century, was not only meant to improve the appearance of the wearer's assets, it was meant to provide a better posture. During the 18th century, the corset was often more decorative and fanciful, accompanied by a large amount of fabric which adorned the wearer. Additionally, the common styles at the time included large skirts which accentuated the hips. But as the century wore on, this style of corsetting actually fell out of style and in favor of the more empire silhouette, which when you think empire silhouette, think more Bridgerton. So although they were waning at the end of the 18th century, corsets hit their peak during the Victorian era, which is defined by the reign loosely of Queen Victoria. I'm also kind of lumping in the Edwardian era. I'm not a historian, but this is just like, I'm kind of just lumping a lot of things together, being more general. During this time, the Victorian era, the Western world experienced a few different styles of corsetting. The corsets were more intense and attempted to achieve an extreme silhouette. During this time, the S-shaped corset was in vogue, along with the cage corset and hoop skirt, reminiscent of the antebellum South. It is also important to note that with this rise in extreme corsetting coincided with the rise of the cult of domesticity and the reaffirmation of traditional gender roles. Here, I just want to note that fashion is so intrinsically linked to culture. It is important to note that there was a rise in traditional gender roles during this time, like I mentioned, and so the corset kind of reflected that and they played into one another, so culture into fashion and vice versa. But as the perception of womanhood changed throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and with the rise of the first wave of feminism, there was a rejection throughout the 20th century of the traditional look of womanhood, which included a rejection of these traditional body modification practices. Instead, women were trying to embrace more of a natural femininity that included multiple different forms. I won't go through every single decade of the 20th century because that would be extreme, but just know everything was changing. So even though the nature of corsets evolved over time throughout the colonial and maybe even more famously in the Victorian times, corsets were a symbol of style and class. The utilization of corsets and tight lacing were meant to evoke feminine beauty and more importantly meant to draw in men who could provide for these women. However, as women became more independent and self-sufficient, the corset waned in prominence. However, this is not to say that the corset has completely left public discourse. In fact, the corset has come in and out of fashion prominence, with Vivienne Westwood and Jean Paul Gaultier incorporating corsets in their fashion line waistlines and popularizing the look of corsets in the 1990s. Even now, corset tops, kind of like the one I'm wearing, these types of tops have come back into vogue and honestly are very cute, hence the reason that I got one. And additionally, corsets have long been a popular staple of cosplaying and role-playing communities. There are so many different utilizations for these corsets, so I just wanted to throw those out there. But even though corsets come back into popular zeitgeist every now and then and in different capacities, it is obvious that they do not hold the same cultural relevance that they did in the past. So now that we've covered a very abbreviated history of corsets, let's dive into the health implications behind them. So I'm actually going to do this part as an audio recording because I recorded some stuff, but the audio was really poor, so I just decided to redo it, but just as an audio version. When I first conceptualized this video, I thought that corsets were bad for your health. I remember in medical anthropology classes, we had seen the ramifications that strict tight lacing had on someone's rib cage and their lung capacity, and it did not look good. Additionally, I think we had all heard stories of people removing ribs to achieve an hourglass figure, but I hadn't looked that deeply into the science behind corsets. And with influencers promoting waist trainers more often, I think it's important to take a look into the actual health ramifications of waist cinching. So let's examine if corsets are really bad for your health. As I mentioned up top, there's a distinction between a traditional corset and actual waist training. So let's first take a look at traditional corsets. Even at the time when corsets were at the height of their popularity, some people, specifically some physicians, were wary of the practice. Physicians were concerned that restrictive tight lacing or tight lacing that was done improperly could restrict breathing. Obviously, in the short term, the restriction of breathing is a problem and can result in the lack of blood flow to other parts of your body. And this is actually backed up by scientists today. Specifically, in a study done by Zhang Zhuna, people who wore corsets, especially incredibly restrictive ones, had lower heart rates, decreased blood flow to the extremities, and less perspiration, which may sound like kind of a good thing, but actually shows that a corset, especially when super constricting, denigrated normal bodily functions. In terms of lumbar support and chronic low back pain, the results for corseting are a little more positive, with studies finding that brief intermittent corset usage actually increased lower back muscle strength and improved lower back pain. So specifically for people with lumbar support issues, corsets and tight lacing can help with back stability and support, which is actually kind of interesting to learn. And I think the main thing I learned from researching these side effects of corsets is just to be careful and know your limits. I think most research suggests that there can be positive effects, if not just no negative effects of corseting, if done properly. And if is the key word. And a lot of times when you hear about fainting spells and abdominal bleeding and other negative causes and ramifications of corseting, it's usually caused by the corset not being correctly worn. To be worn properly, a corset should not be incredibly restrictive and also not worn for long periods of time. That is why it's crucial to ease into corset usage and look up guides on how to do it correctly. It is literally training your waist, and training takes time. And speaking of training, let's move on to examine the health effects of weight trainers. Like the corset, the modern waist trainer is heavily marred with controversy. However, unlike the corset, the waist trainer does not have many redeeming qualities. Many waist training companies have numerous dubious claims, like their product promotes weight loss and strengthens core muscles, but this is actually summarily not true. In fact, waist trainers can actually lead to weakened abdominal muscles, cause spinal issues, constrict breathing, cause digestive issues, cause literal organ failure, and overall be super bad for your health. And I cannot stress this enough, do not wear waist trainers. They're super dangerous for your health, especially since they're being recommended to be worn 8 hours a day during exercise and even during and after pregnancy. And to top it all off, the perceived hourglass shape people claim to have after waist training is fake. They may temporarily have a few inches removed from their waist, but this is simply because they've lost water weight. It's all really a mirage. And to be honest, it is actually disgusting that influencers market these products to their susceptible followers. I know I'm not the first person to bemoan influencers and influencer marketing, but oh my god, the more I read into waist training, the scarier it becomes. This could seriously impact someone's life, and influencers are using them to just cash a quick buck. They try to market it like, oh, look at me, look at my body, it's great, but in reality,
reality, they just have the money to spend to make their body look a certain way. The normal everyday person will never look like these influencers, and that's okay. But influencers are cashing in on these insecurities of their followers without caring enough to realize they are harming their fans. It's just sick, and honestly, I can't believe that people keep getting away with selling these things, and personally, I think there should be more regulations, but I mean, that's just me. It drives me just up a wall to keep thinking about these waist training scams and how influencers use them to just make money. I think my best advice on this is that there aren't quick fixes, and quick fixes do not exist. If you're looking for an hourglass shape, just keep in mind, 1, not everyone has the literal bone structure for an hourglass figure, and that's okay. And 2, if you really want to lose inches off your waist, either try to lose it naturally and safely, or buy ethical shapewear that will not kill you. Anyway, I'm frustrated, so let's just move on.
So for this video, I had a goal of buying a corset, and maybe I'm just ignorant, but I truly did not anticipate them being quite so expensive. I think that's just a me thing. I think pretty much people know they're expensive. I mean, when I was looking for quality corsets, they range from like $100 to $400, and I was like, oh my gosh, I did not expect that. When I was looking for a reasonably priced waist trainer or corset on Amazon, which I do not like buying from Amazon usually, but when I looked at them, I had some concerns over their quality. So for every review that said the product was the best purchase they had ever made, there were a bunch of others that warned against this product, saying that the product caused skin irritation, burning sensations on their skin, and itchiness, which was just red flags all around. So I did not anticipate that, but I was persistent and really wanted to look more into, okay, if I can't buy an Amazon corset, where should I go? While looking, I saw a large range in quality, cut, and stylistic choices for corsets and waist trainers, with the waist trainers looking a bit more like a cross between like a traditional shapewear look and like an Olympic weightlifting belt, and those look very different than the traditional corsets, while the corsets had some more shapewear looking items and pieces, but also a lot that looked like you were straight off of the cast of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Honestly, I was a little overwhelmed with my options or lack thereof, and so I turned to the internet to help me find something, and what I found instead was a little unexpected. While looking online, I was pleased to find that there was a pretty robust community of people who enjoyed corsetting, tight lacing, waist training, etc. I stumbled upon not only loads of websites devoted to the art form, but Reddit communities such as r/corsetting and r/tight lacing, and other forums and Facebook groups devoted to the art. And this is where I actually really began to like the community, because even though the body modification aspects of the corsetting world are unsightly and disturbing at times, the community of artisans, cosplayers, historians, and general corset enthusiasts was so wholesome, and I really enjoyed looking into that. The community was actually very supportive and consisted of people offering genuine and helpful advice about corsetting, waist training, and tight lacing. I actually found it really cool and inspiring to see these groups recommend corset artisans, help others with DIY designs, and make decisions about tight lacing. And genuinely seeing all these cool corset creations, costumes, and fashion, I was really inspired. So from what I could see through these communities, there were many reasons people wore corsets: for fun, pleasure, Renaissance fairs, LARPing, and even a little bit for body shaping and modification. But instead of being beholden to the patriarchal ideals of femininity, people within these communities were taking back the corset and making them their own. It was within these forums that I really came to understand the art of the corset and how people choose to use them. It is also here where I decided if I really wanted a corset, I was going to have to save up and spend some real money. I couldn't just buy something off of Amazon. They really were super against that. People were saying like, oh, not only is it cheap quality, but they were worried about the tight lacing aspect of it. And if you were not experienced at tight lacing, they really warned against getting the cheap material. So I took that to heart. And so I did not buy a corset for this video. However, I do still want to buy one, but I want to make sure I am an ethical consumer, but also that I'm getting a good corset. So before making this video, I thought that across the board that corsets and waist trainers were bad, and that waist training was an awful diet scheme that influencers used to just make some quick money on the side, to sell to their constituents without any kind of reasonable medical experience or background. And while some of that last part is still true, and there is a lot of ethical concerns with like blindly giving people advice to go get waist trainers, I think there's a lot more nuance to it. The art of body modifications can be linked to harmful ideologies and has a long history of aligning the female figure to patriarchal views. But in the modern era, corsets have actually been taken back by people to try to empower themselves because they either like the look of them or use them for a multitude of reasons. And although there are still some issues with people feeling compelled to buy shapewear because they feel like they want to fit a certain ideal, I think that corsetting in general has come a long way and is now utilized primarily as an art form. So usually I take like a very hardline stance for or against things, but in this case I'm kind of just like stuck in this middle ground of like, I think it's good if you kind of do your research and look it up and make sure you're not tight-lacing to like really constrict yourself, but also it can be bad and used in malicious ways when it's specifically waist trainers that have a certain code with them. Yeah, I think that that can be bad. So in general, there is nothing wrong with wanting a snatched waist or a hourglass figure. I think feminism is about empowering people to choose whatever they want to choose and whatever lifestyle they'd like to live. And honestly, it's a very cute style. I just couldn't figure out how to not make myself look like a pirate. But that is all I have for you today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.